Picture this. America is drowning in $36 trillion of debt. China owes $15 trillion. Japan is buried under $10 trillion. Germany, the UK, France, every economic powerhouse you can name is leveraged to the breaking point. Add it all together, and you get a number so massive it defies comprehension. $317 trillion in total global debt. That's not just big. That's 3 times the entire economic output of planet Earth. Every factory, every business, every transaction, everything humanity produces in a year wouldn't even cover 1/3 of what we collectively owe. But here's where it gets strange. If literally everyone is in debt, if every government, every corporation, every household is a borrower, then who exactly is doing the lending? Debt isn't magic. For every dollar borrowed, someone had to lend it. For every liability on one balance sheet, there's an asset on another. So if the whole world owes $317 trillion, that means someone, somewhere, is holding $317 trillion in IOUs. Who are these people? Where are they? And why does nobody ever talk about them? Welcome to Finance Folder, where we break down the systems that shape your financial reality. Before you click away thinking this is just another conspiracy video, understand this. What I'm about to show you isn't theory. It's accounting. Cold, hard, verifiable math. The global debt system operates on mechanisms that are documented, legal, and openly discussed in central banking publications. The only reason it seems invisible is because nobody explains how the pieces fit together. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly who holds the $317 trillion, how they engineered a system where they always win, and why the coming collapse will make them even richer while everyone else loses everything. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. When you think about debt, you probably imagine it like borrowing money from a friend. Your friend has $100. You need it. They lend it to you. You pay them back with interest. Everyone understands this model because it makes intuitive sense. Here's the problem. That's not remotely how modern debt works. When governments borrow money, the money they're borrowing doesn't exist until they borrow it. Let me say that again because it's the key to everything. The money is created through the act of borrowing. The US government needs $1 trillion. They issue treasury bonds, the Federal Reserve steps in and announces they'll purchase $500 billion worth of those bonds. Commercial banks buy the rest. Now here's the question nobody asks. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion? Do they have a vault somewhere filled with cash? Do they collect taxes? No. They create the money out of thin air by making electronic entries on a spreadsheet. The Fed's balance sheet magically expands by $500 billion in assets and $500 billion in corresponding liabilities. The commercial banks do essentially the same thing using fractional reserve mechanisms. Before the government issued those bonds, that $1 trillion did not exist anywhere in the economy. Now it does. Money was conjured into existence through debt. But here's where the trap snaps shut. When that $1 trillion gets created, only the principal amount materializes. The interest doesn't get created. If the government borrows $1 trillion at 5% interest, they owe $1 trillion plus $50 billion per year in interest payments. But only the trillion was created. That $50 billion has to come from somewhere else. Where? From future borrowing, or from taxing the money that already exists in circulation. This creates a mathematical impossibility baked into the system. Total debt will always exceed total money supply because interest exists as an obligation but was never created as money. The system requires constant expansion of debt just to service the debt that already exists. This isn't a flaw that regulators overlooked. This is architecture. This is design. This is the engine that drives everything you're about to learn. Now let me show you exactly who's holding the $317 trillion. There are 4 major categories: central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and ultra-wealthy individuals. Let's break down each one. Central banks hold roughly $25 trillion in government debt globally. The Federal Reserve holds about $5 trillion in U.S. treasuries. The Bank of Japan holds $5 trillion in Japanese government bonds. The European Central Bank holds $5 trillion in European debt. The People's Bank of China holds $3 trillion in Chinese government bonds. These institutions create money specifically to buy government debt, which allows governments to spend far beyond their tax revenues. But here's what most people don't realize. Central banks aren't actually government entities. Take the Federal Reserve. Most Americans think it's part of the Treasury Department or some government agency. It's not. The Federal Reserve is a private institution owned by member banks. There are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, and they issue shares to commercial banks like J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. Those banks receive a guaranteed 6% annual dividend on their Federal Reserve shares. When the Federal Reserve holds trillions in government bonds and collects interest payments, where does that interest ultimately flow? To the private banking institutions that own the Fed. The public has been conditioned to believe the Federal Reserve serves the national interest. In reality, it's a banking cartel established in 1913 specifically to enable private financial institutions to profit from government borrowing. Look at history. The Bank of England was created in 1694 explicitly as a private company designed to lend money to the government. King William needed £1.2 million to finance a war against France. Parliament authorized the creation of a private bank that would lend the government that money in exchange for the exclusive right to issue currency and collect interest paid by taxpayers. From the very beginning, central banks existed to enrich private bankers by transforming government borrowing into a profit center. The structures have evolved and become more opaque, but the fundamental mechanism remains identical. Central banks create money, purchase government bonds, and extract interest funded by tax revenue. That interest flows to the financial elite who control these institutions. The second category is institutional investors, and this is where the numbers get truly staggering. Institutional investors collectively hold approximately 120 trillion in global debt. This category includes pension funds holding roughly 50 trillion, insurance companies holding 35 trillion, mutual funds holding 25 trillion, and sovereign wealth funds holding 10 trillion. Now you might think pension funds are owned by workers, and technically that's true on paper. But workers don't control these funds. Fund managers control them, and fund managers are compensated based on assets under management, which creates incentives completely misaligned with pensioner interests. Insurance companies like MetLife, Prudential, and AIG are publicly traded corporations, but stock ownership is heavily concentrated. The wealthiest 10% of households own 89% of all stocks and bonds in America. Insurance companies are effectively controlled by the wealthy. Then you have the asset management giants. Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street collectively manage over 20 trillion in assets. Vanguard claims to be owned by its fund investors, but operational control rests entirely with management. BlackRock and State Street are publicly traded with ownership concentrated among wealthy shareholders and other institutional investors. The pattern is consistent across every institutional category. A small management class controls the capital, and the economic benefits flow disproportionately to the wealthy elite. Third category, foreign governments. Foreign governments hold about 30 trillion in debt issued by other nations. China holds 3.2 trillion in foreign assets, including 850 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan holds 1.1 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. Why do foreign governments accumulate other countries' debt? Because of trade imbalances? When China exports 500 billion more in goods to America than it imports, China receives 500 billion in U.S. dollars. What does China do with those dollars? They buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This system creates mutual dependency. America gets cheap manufactured goods and immediate consumption. China finances those purchases by lending the money back. In the short term, both sides benefit. In the long term, it creates structural vulnerabilities. But even within foreign governments, the benefits concentrate at the top. When China holds trillions in foreign bonds, who benefits? Not the factory worker in Shenzhen. The Chinese government holds those bonds, controlled by Communist Party elites who direct how that wealth gets deployed. The fourth category is where things get really interesting. Wealthy individuals and family offices. The global top 1% holds approximately 40 trillion in financial assets, much of it in bonds. The top 0.1% holds 20 trillion. The top 0.01%, which represents about 500,000 families worldwide, holds 10 trillion. These are families like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Mars family, the Koch brothers, the Saudi royal family, and thousands of other dynastic wealth holders you've never heard of. When you possess $10 billion in wealth, you don't keep it in a checking account. You buy government bonds, corporate bonds, and other debt instruments that generate reliable interest income. A family with 10 billion in bonds earning 4% receives $400 million every single year in interest payments. They don't work, they don't manufacture products, they don't provide services. They collect 400 million annually from interest paid by borrowers who are working, producing, and paying taxes. This is the core mechanism of wealth concentration through debt. The wealthy lend to everyone else and collect interest in perpetuity. That interest gets paid through taxes extracted from workers, through corporate profits, squeezed from employees, through mortgage payments made by families. Wealth flows from billions of people upward to thousands of families through the debt system. Let's add up those four categories. Central banks hold 25 trillion, institutional investors hold 120 trillion, foreign governments hold 30 trillion, ultra-wealthy individuals hold 40 trillion. That's 215 trillion out of the total 317 trillion. What about the remaining 102 trillion? It's held by smaller institutional investors, corporate treasury departments, middle-class savers with bond funds and retirement accounts, and various other entities. But even this remainder is disproportionately held by the wealthy because wealth itself is radically concentrated. The bottom 50% of humanity holds virtually zero financial assets. They hold debt, they owe mortgages, student loans, credit card balances, car loans. They're the borrowers. The top 10% holds the vast majority of financial assets. They're the lenders. So the answer to the question of who is the lender is straightforward. The wealthy, operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct holdings they manage. The debt system functions as a mechanism to systematically transfer wealth from the poor and middle class who borrow to the rich who lend. Now let me show you how this mechanism has operated throughout history, because this isn't new, this is ancient. Medieval Europe, 1200 to 1500 AD, the Catholic Church was the dominant lender. Monarchs borrowed from the church to finance wars and territorial expansion. By 1500, the Catholic Church owned approximately 25% of all land in Europe, acquired largely through foreclosures on unpaid debts. The Medici family in Florence during the 1400s became the wealthiest dynasty in Europe exclusively through lending. They lent to kings, popes, and merchants across the continent. The interest income from their lending operations exceeded profits from any commercial enterprise. By 1450, the Medici were so powerful they could install popes and manipulate monarchs. The Bank of England, created in 1694, was the formalization of the debt wealth system on a national scale. King William needed £1.2 million for war financing. Parliament authorized the creation of a private bank that would lend money to the government. That bank received interest paid by taxpayers and secured the exclusive right to issue currency. This was the blueprint that would be replicated worldwide. Create a private institution with government-granted monopoly on money creation. That institution lends to the government. Taxpayers fund interest payments to the private institution. The institution's shareholders accumulate wealth through perpetual interest income. The Rothschild family in the 1800s perfected this system to an art form. Meyer Amschel Rothschild had 5 sons. He sent each son to a different European capital: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt. Each son established a banking house. The family lent to every major European government simultaneously. After the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the Rothschilds held more government debt than any family in recorded history. Nathan Rothschild in London famously stated, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." By 1850, the Rothschild family held an estimated 50% of all government bonds in Europe. They collected interest from every major nation. The wealth they accumulated through lending exceeded the GDP of most countries. J.P. Morgan, in early 1900s America, replicated the exact same model. Morgan lent to governments, railroads, and industrial corporations. By 1912, Morgan controlled banks that held 25% of all financial assets in the United States. The pattern across 800 years is absolutely identical. Those who lend accumulate wealth. Those who borrow become dependent. The lenders accumulate wealth through interest income without producing anything tangible. The borrowers work and produce but owe ever-escalating amounts. The system is specifically designed to ensure debt can never be fully repaid. The mathematical trap is elegantly simple. When money gets created through debt, only the principal materializes, not the interest. This means total debt will always exceed total money supply. If the global money supply is 100 trillion but total debt is 120 trillion, including accrued interest, it becomes mathematically impossible to repay all debt simultaneously. The only way to service existing debt is to create new debt. You borrow new money to pay interest on old debt. This makes total debt larger, requiring even more borrowing in the future. Debt grows exponentially by mathematical necessity. This explains why global debt has exploded from 40 trillion in 1992, 317 trillion in 2025. That's nearly an eightfold increase in just 35 years. Debt doubles approximately every 10 years, and it must continue growing because if new debt creation stops, there's no money available to pay interest on existing debt, and the entire system implodes. The architects of this system understood this dynamic perfectly. The founders of the Bank of England in 1694 knew that once the government borrowed £1.2 million, it could never fully repay because interest obligations would exceed money supply. This isn't a bug, this is the feature. Perpetual debt guarantees perpetual interest income. Perpetual interest income guarantees perpetual wealth transfer from borrowers to lenders. Let me show you who benefits from this system right now in the modern economy. In 2024, global interest payments on 317 trillion in debt totaled approximately $15 trillion. That's 15 trillion flowing from borrowers to lenders in a single year. Governments pay interest through taxation. The U.S. government pays $900 billion annually in interest on its 36 trillion national debt. That $900 billion comes directly from taxpayers and flows to bondholders. Corporations pay interest through profit extraction. Corporations globally hold about 90 trillion in debt. They pay roughly 5 trillion in annual interest. Where does that money originate? From the difference between what they pay workers and what they charge consumers. Workers produce value. Corporations capture that value. A portion gets transferred to creditors as interest. Households pay interest through wages. Households globally hold 60 trillion in debt and pay approximately 3 trillion in annual interest. A family earning $70,000 per year, paying $15,000 in mortgage interest and $5,000 in other interest payments, sends 29% of their income directly to creditors. So that 15 trillion in annual interest payments flows from taxpayers, workers, and households upward to central banks, institutional investors, foreign governments, and ultra-wealthy individuals. The top 1% globally captures approximately 40% of that 15 trillion in annual interest income. That's 6 trillion per year flowing to roughly 80 million people. The top 0.1% captures 20%, which equals 3 trillion flowing to 8 million people. The top 0.01%, just 800,000 individuals, captures 10%, which is 1.5 trillion annually. 800,000 people receive 1.5 trillion per year in interest income from a debt system where 8 billion people function as borrowers or taxpayers funding those interest payments. That works out to nearly $2 million per person in the top 0.01% from interest income alone, not including any other income sources. This is the wealth concentration mechanism in its purest form. Debt funnels wealth from billions to millions to thousands to hundreds of families at the absolute top. The concentration accelerates because interest income compounds. If you receive 10 million in interest income this year, you use it to purchase more bonds, which generate more interest next year, which you use to buy even more bonds. Wealth compounds exponentially for creditors, while debtors remain trapped in perpetual repayment cycles. Consider the Rothschild family. In 1850, they held approximately $2 billion in assets, adjusted for inflation, and accounting for 175 years of compound interest. The family's current wealth is estimated between $500 billion and $1 trillion. They didn't build tech companies. They didn't invent products. They lent money and collected interest for 7 generations. This pattern repeats across every generationally wealthy family. Initial wealth often originated from business ventures, but perpetual wealth gets maintained through lending. They own bonds, they collect interest, they reinvest. The system guarantees their wealth grows indefinitely as long as the debt system continues operating. And the system must continue because if it stops, everything collapses. Governments need debt to function. Corporations need debt to expand. Households need debt to purchase homes, vehicles, and education. The entire modern economy is architecturally dependent on debt, and debt requires creditors. The creditors are the wealthy. The wealthy use the debt system to extract wealth from everyone else through interest payments that never end because the debt can never be repaid. But the system has a mathematical endpoint that's rapidly approaching. Debt cannot grow forever. Global debt currently sits at 330% of GDP. Debt is growing at 7% annually. GDP is growing at 3% annually. If current trends continue, global debt will exceed 400% of GDP by 2035. At 400%, interest payments alone would consume 40% of total global economic output. That's categorically unsustainable. Something has to break. There are only 3 possible outcomes. Governments default, which wipes out bondholders but collapses the financial system. Governments inflate, which transfers wealth through currency debasement but destroys savings. Or governments impose debt jubilees, which cancel debt but fundamentally restructure society. All 3 outcomes destroy middle-class wealth while protecting elite wealth because the elite hold hard assets, multiple currencies, and geographically diversified holdings. The middle class holds debt, local currency, and geographically concentrated assets. This asymmetry is intentional. The system was engineered to concentrate wealth during both expansion and collapse. During expansion, the wealthy collect interest on perpetual debt. During collapse, the wealthy purchased assets at fire sale prices from bankrupt borrowers. This happened during the Great Depression. When banks foreclosed on farms, wealthy investors bought those farms at pennies on the dollar. Small independent farmers became tenant farmers working land they used to own. This happened in 2008 when homeowners defaulted on mortgages. BlackRock, Invitation Homes, and private equity firms bought hundreds of thousands of homes at 50% discounts. Homeownership rates declined. Corporate ownership rates increased. This will happen in the next crisis. When the debt system fractures, the middle class holding debt will default on obligations. The wealthy holding liquid capital will buy defaulted assets at massive discounts. The 317 trillion debt system isn't a crisis. It's a wealth extraction mechanism specifically designed to transfer wealth from the many to the few during both prosperous times and catastrophic times. You cannot escape this system because it's global and you pay interest on your mortgage to a bank owned by shareholders who are statistically wealthy. You pay taxes that service government debt owned by bondholders who are statistically wealthy. Every single economic transaction contains an embedded interest component that flows upward. The average American pays roughly $20,000 annually in direct and indirect interest across all categories. Over a lifetime, that totals $1.4 million in interest payments flowing from you to creditors who are on average 100 times wealthier than you. This is the system in its essence. Create money through debt, charge interest, collect perpetually, concentrate wealth in the hands of creditors, ensure debt can never be repaid so interest never stops flowing. The $317 trillion question has a clear answer. The lender is a small global elite, operating through central banks they control, institutions they own, and direct holdings they manage. They function as creditors to everyone else. The interest payments flowing from 8 billion people to the top few million represents the largest wealth transfer in human history, occurring every single day, invisibly embedded in every transaction. But here's the final insight that makes this truly diabolical. Even the eventual collapse will benefit the creditor class because they'll convert paper claims into tangible hard assets during the crisis. The system extracts wealth during expansion through interest income and extracts wealth during collapse through asset acquisition. If everyone is in debt, who is the creditor? Now you know. The people who designed the system to ensure they would always be creditors while everyone else would always be debtors. That system, operating through 317 trillion in debt and extracting 15 trillion annually in interest, is the mechanism by which the modern global economy transfers wealth from bottom to top perpetually and inevitably. If this video showed you who actually holds the 317 trillion in global debt and why the debt system functions as a designed wealth extraction mechanism, make sure you subscribe to Finance Folder and hit that like button, because the next video will reveal the endgame. What happens when 317 trillion becomes 500 trillion and interest payments exceed total global GDP? The three possible outcomes: default, inflation, or jubilee. Which outcome the elite are positioning for, and why all three outcomes transfer wealth from the middle class to the top. How you can protect yourself when the system finally breaks. The 317 trillion question has an answer. The 500 trillion question is what comes next, and that answer determines whether you preserve your wealth or lose everything when the debt system finally fractures.